Back in Genesis 12, we saw God make some amazing promises to Abraham, telling him the whole world would be blessed through his descendants. Well, 3 chapters and many years later, God returns to Abraham, and nothing much has changed. It seems from what he says at the start of verse 3 that Abraham is beginning to doubt. He says, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." You see how that's a prediction for the future. So God reassures him by reaffirming his promise. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Then he took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And Abraham, despite all the physical evidence to the contrary, Abraham believed God. He believed him. He actually trusted him. And we read in verse 6 that because Abraham had faith in God and in his word, God credited it to him as righteousness. In other words, upon seeing the faith that Abraham had, God gave him the gift of righteousness. Now, the Bible makes clear that even that faith that Abraham possessed was a gift from God in the first place. This idea of righteousness in response to faith is going to be incredibly important throughout the Bible. And in fact, this very verse is picked up in the book of Hebrews as the textbook example of what it looks like to be saved by faith and not by works. As we read in Ephesians chapter 2, it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this, as in this faith even, is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Now, the second half of this chapter shows that this is God's work and not Abraham's. On the surface, at least, it is very strange. Now, God has made these promises to Abraham before, but when he restates them here, he conducts a kind of ceremony to go along with these covenant promises. Now, that part is not all that strange, to be honest. We do the same sort of thing today. So, for example, when we make a commitment in marriage, we often have a ceremony to go along with those promises that are being made. And the ceremony itself is full of symbolism and elegance and beauty and significance. Well, here's a ceremony for the cutting of a covenant. Verse 9. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. Just picture the scene, okay? So you've got just bits of animal on the floor in halves, spread either side of a kind of implied pathway of blood. 2 halves of a heifer, 2 halves of a goat, 2 halves of a ram, and 2 dead birds. Just a makeshift valley of blood and death. This is the way that covenants were often made in the ancient world, actually. So the two people making promises, making a covenant with one another, would enact this kind of ceremony, and then they would walk through the aisle of blood with one another, saying what they've promised. Symbolically, they're saying, look, if I don't hold up my end of the deal, may I be like these animals, torn and broken in two. If I abandon this relationship, then may my body be broken and my blood be spilled like this. Now here's the fascinating thing. Look at verse 12. While the ceremony is being enacted, while God is telling Abraham what will happen and what he promises to do, what is Abraham doing? Snoring. Well, maybe not snoring, but he's fast asleep at the very least. You see that in verse 12? In other words, God is making the promises and God is taking the consequences for both sides of this agreement. He's saying, look, if I break this covenant and abandon this relationship, may I be torn to pieces like this. Well, we know that's not going to happen because God always keeps his promises. But he's also saying, if you and your descendants break the covenant, abandon the relationship, then may I be torn to pieces as well. The consequences of either side failing will land on just one party because just one party walks through the valley of blood and death. In other words, God says, I will bless the world, Abraham, through your family line, and I will do it even if it kills me. And of course, we know that it did. Jesus' body was broken, and his blood was shed, and all the work was done by him on our behalf to reconcile us to God. This is salvation by grace and not by works. It is given by God, not earned by man. Abraham contributed nothing here. He didn't and he couldn't, because he was fast asleep. And yet God saved. Why? Because he promised that he would. And the same is true today. God saves by grace all those who have faith in him, and even that faith is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast.